Hello, the title of this larger project is there a least cost path to recovery? Comparing alternative management strategies to address multiple interacting stressors on least Bell's Vireo populations. The team of PIs and co-PIs on this project all have extensive experience in their relative areas of expertise. Our project is led by Dr. Richard Fisher of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Research and Development Center, who brings experience in avian ecology and serving as a liaison to many agencies with a strong interest in this research. Mr. Casey Lott of Conservation Science and Data Visualization, LLC, has extensive experience working in the Bell's Least Vireo system, as well as working with many tools and approaches underlying this project. Dr. Pat Zollner of the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University brings expertise in agent-based modeling, as well as behavioral and landscape ecology. Dr. Jeff Holland of Purdue University's Department of Entomology brings expertise in beetle spatial ecology, statistical analysis, and landscape ecology. And Ms. Melissa Rode of California Nature Conservancy brings extensive experience in groundwater management and groundwater ecosystems, focused in the Southern California area study system for this research. Least Bell's Vireo were listed as a federally endangered species in 1986, about 35 years ago. At that time, the main listing factors were historic riparian habitat loss and cowbird parasitism, which had led to range contraction and population declines. In the past decade, the path of outright riparian habitat loss has slowed, and targeted cowbird control has been successful at increasing and expanding populations. Current concerns for this species are related to riparian habitat degradation by drought, exotic plant invasion, exotic insect impacts, increasing water use, potential water supply problems, and uncertainty about how much cowbird control is needed and where it is needed. Least Bell's Vireo are among the most costly endangered species to the Department of Defense, with expenditures exceeding $2 million annually when including both military installations and Army Civil Works projects. Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations for Least Bell's Vireo often result in loss of operational flexibility and costly biological opinions on multiple installations and civil works projects. Fundamental knowledge of how multiple stressors interact to affect Vireo population dynamics is lacking. Cost-effective strategies for managing multiple interacting stressors are needed to achieve recovery and to sustain Vireo populations after delisting. To address this problem, we will develop and use analyses from an agent-based model called RESET, Recovery of Endangered Species with Emerging Threats, as a novel tool for predicting the effects of multiple interacting stressors on Least Bell Vireo populations and development of cost-effective management alternatives. RESET will be developed as an agent-based model. Agent-based models are simulation tools that are useful for research in many fields, as evidenced by the exponentially increasing number of papers published using them. Ecologists used to refer to them as individual-based models, but now also tend to use agent-based models instead of individual-based models. The classic example of an agent-based modeling tool is a Boyd's model, in which virtual agents are given 2 or 3 simple rules for how their movements respond to conspecifics. When each agent is following these rules in a simulated environment, the collective movement of the group of agents closely resembles how actual fish, school, or birds flock through time and space. There are several critical distinctions between the agent-based modeling approach and classical ecological models of wildlife populations. The bottom-up approach of agent-based models track each individual or agent in a manner that is consistent with the principles of natural selection and allow for mechanistic insight into the influence of simulated rules. The explicit simulation of unique agents avoids assumptions that all individual agents within strata are identical. Such assumptions are common to classical top-down approaches, and avoiding that assumption makes ABMs better at identifying the implications of the range of heterogeneity we find in the real world. As with the Boyd's example, the phenomenon of interest when using agent-based models often emerges from the collective interaction of virtual agents with each other and the simulated environment around them, rather than having it imposed from top-down assumptions. Agent-based models provide laboratories in which researchers can compare scenario-based questions upon common sets of assumptions while challenging controlled sets of conditions across replicate models. This allows agent-based models to be used to ask questions that could never be investigated empirically because we only have one replicate planet Earth. The use of agent-based models to compare scenarios is an ideal way to provide pragmatic inference for practitioners about the relative likelihood of different outcomes given different management choices. Collectively, all of these advantages make agent-based models robust tools for investigating complex systems, particularly when there are interactions among many stressors. Thus, an agent-based model is an ideal approach for the development of reset to address the challenges related to least Bell's Vireo management. Finally, numerous papers have codified best practices for various aspects of agent-based modeling research. These include standards for developing agent-based models, communicating their design, and using them to draw inference about management. We will adhere to these best practices in the development of reset to ensure management recommendations derived from its application meet the highest standards of credibility. Threats and stressors to Vireo populations are numerous. Some of these, such as cowbird parasitism, habitat loss, and invasive plants, contributed to their federal listing, while others, such as climate change-induced drought, fire, and exotic insect invasions, are emerging threats. The ecological systems that maintain Vireo populations are characterized by limited resources, multiple stressors, and strong drivers. Previous research has not addressed each individual stressor, the relative strengths of stressors, interactions among stressors, or how changes in drivers may change stressor interactions. Without this research emphasis, it is difficult to know which stressor or set of stressors to address via management to reach Vireo recovery. The reset model is designed to answer this question. Least Bell's vireos place their nests in a small number of groundwater-dependent riparian plant species, like willow and mulefat. Concurrently, there is no statewide vegetation map that covers these three species. Historic vegetation maps and range-wide observations of Least Bell's vireo were used to create the footprint for a new mapping effort that our team is undertaking with U.S. Marine Corps funding. One reviewer requested more information on this effort. The contemporary mapping effort will follow high-resolution mapping protocols using up-to-date imagery from 2020 that will distinguish among riparian plants that vireos do and do not use for nesting. Vegetation patches from this map will be the primary habitat inputs to the reset model. This will allow us to simulate alternative invasive plant and cowbird management strategies to find which are most cost-effective for vireos based on the current patchy distribution of vireo populations and threats to their nesting habitat. In 2013, the state of California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act into law. This act required local groundwater sustainability agencies to address impacts to groundwater-dependent ecosystems, particularly those with threatened and endangered species. Groundwater-dependent ecosystems are defined as the species or ecological communities that rely on groundwater. These include species that rely directly on groundwater, such as paraphyletic willows with roots that extend beneath the ground to access groundwater during dry summers, or species that rely indirectly on groundwater, such as Least Bell's vireo that nest within willows. 4 species of tamarisk leaf beetle have been intentionally introduced to help control tamarisk, a reduced tamarisk tree that is sometimes used for nests, a reduced riparian tree, tamarisk, a reduced riparian tree that is sometimes used for nesting by vireos. Both larval and adults of tamarisk leaf beetles feed on tamarisk foliage. This feeding does not immediately kill the plant, but mortality may occur after multiple defoliations compounded with other stressors. Defoliation reduces cover and habitat quality, as can be seen in the figure above. Polyphagous shoot-hole borer is an exotic invasive species, ambrosia beetle, that was recently expanded into California. This beetle creates galleries under the bark wherein fungus is farmed and larvae develop. The fungus results in high mortality rates in affected trees and shrubs. Shoot-hole borers use many different species of trees, so they pose a threat beyond common riparian plants like tamarisk or willow. Least Bell's vireo are subject to high levels of nest parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds. Background levels of predation by human commensal predators are also high. Combining these two sources of mortality may limit population growth. In several areas, consistent cowbird control has reversed population declines. Despite background depredation in other areas, cowbird parasitism still hampers recovery in drainages with minimal control. Significant uncertainty remains about how much cowbird control is needed and where to recover vireos and sustain population gains after delisting. This slide outlines the 6 tasks that will be addressed in the technical approach section of the presentation. We have positioned go, no-go decision points in 2 places. First, once we have assembled all model inputs, we will evaluate whether or not they are sufficiently capture initial conditions for all model system components. When model inputs closely match real conditions, simulation models are more likely to recommend actionable, spatially explicit management solutions. Our second no-go point is after we have developed and thoroughly tested all submodels and the integrated model. At this point, we will ask if the integrated model produces credible predictions of system behavior. We will ensure that the answer is yes before moving on to applied simulation experiments to answer applicable questions about multiple stressors and management alternatives. The development of RESET will begin with a workshop that brings together our project team and stakeholders. The meeting will inform considerations for RESET's design to ensure that the ultimate end users of this model will benefit from its outputs. Such engagement with practitioners have proven critical to numerous applications of agent-based models to solve real-world conservation problems. Following this feedback session, our research team will proceed to a retreat where we will collectively make many decisions about how to proceed with the development of RESET. Expected outcomes of the workshop followed by the retreat will be the establishment of a cloud-based platform that all project co-PIs will use to interact throughout the modeling process. Once this work environment is established, we will reach a consensus on the structure of the model and the elements, such as how submodels will interact within the simulation. Next, we will produce a formal ODD document describing RESET according to the established procedures and use that document to delineate data needs throughout all phases of the project. From there, each PI will proceed to develop code for their respective submodels, while the Zollner lab develops working code for the integration of all submodels into the overall structure of RESET. Both the overall RESET model, as well as each submodel, will be rigorously tested by critically examining model inputs and outputs. The version of code resulting from testing will be further evaluated in the coding sandbox to assess model performance across the range of stressors and through their interactions, as well as management scenarios. Throughout this process, we will revise RESET as needed before proceeding to task 2. This slide illustrates how RESET's submodels will be integrated through their common interactions with vegetative patches. Different PIs will develop specific process submodels that relate to their disciplinary expertise, but a critical element of the early project workshop and follow-up retreat will be the establishment of a common set of expectations of what state variables or vegetation patches are changed by which submodels at what temporal resolution. The figure categorizes submodels by colors that indicate the temporal resolution that each of these forces result in changes to patch state variables. Vegetative patches integrate all of RESET's facets and provide the foundation for evaluating least bell Vireo population performance relative to multiple stressors and management strategies. All management alternatives will be focused on subsets of vegetative patches across ranges of vireos. Patches of vireo habitat are indicated with orange dots on this figure, representing a small portion of the broader extent across which RESET will be developed. The spatial relationship of patches reflects how spatial proximity will be critical for many submodel processes, such as the spread of invasive beetle populations. The distribution of vegetative patches within different ownership boundaries will constrain the development of agency-specific management strategies to areas where they have management authority. Finally, the tag and the graphic illustrates how a number of state variables will be tracked for each vegetation patch during a single time step in RESET. This slide illustrates how RESET, like all agent-based models, simulates ecological processes as discrete events. By modeling how conditions change across space, e.g. at all vegetative patches, in response to submodels that are executed at each successive time step, submodels use values for state variables at all sites at given time steps as inputs, and then generate new values for state variables at each site at time t+1 until the model finishes execution at time t+n. Submodels execute in a scheduled manner so that a different submodel can update entities' state variables at temporal resolutions that are most appropriate for the process they represent. This allows for submodels to interact and influence response variables of interest related to vegetative patches and the Vireo populations within them. This interaction results in the emergence of collective system-level behaviors as the environmental conditions change at each time step of model execution, and as heterogeneous individuals interact with each other within this changing environment. Reset will require several different model inputs to create initial conditions and to drive how these conditions change over time. The range-wide vegetation map of 2020 will provide initial conditions for the universe of vegetative patches across the range of Vireos. A 35-year time series of annual groundwater levels from the state of California will be used to update groundwater levels at vegetative patches in the study area in annual increments. Initial conditions for the distribution and abundance of Vireo populations will be based on a recently completed synthesis of monitoring information from many different data sources. For both beetles, fieldwork in season 1 will refine and clarify the leading edge of the known invasion fronts. Within the beetle established region, standard protocols will be used to measure presence, absence, and relative abundance at different vegetation patches. Regression analyses will establish the correlation between beetle population levels and vegetative patch sizes, as well as defoliation status for the tamarisk leaf beetle and vegetative connectivity for the polyphagous shoot-hole borer. Vegetation growth and condition for Vireo nest plant success and exotic plants will be modeled at each vegetative patch using species-specific response curves to changing groundwater levels. Recent research on beetle impacts will be used to simulate defoliation and beetle-related mortality at each patch where they are present. Vegetative mortality due to flooding and pioneering plant establishment after flooding will be modeled by identifying major floods in each specific time series of daily flow data, and then performing before-after comparisons of vegetative patches and aerial photographs to identify the magnitude of floods that result in the removal of riparian vegetation in active channels. Behavioral submodels will be developed for Vireo nesting habitat patch selection, re-nesting behavior after parasitism or depredation, and interannual dispersal among vegetative patches. These will follow the same processes of developing as similar submodels that were developed for interior lease terns and turn-pop agent-based model, which simulated endangered bird species response to changing conditions on rivers. Tamarisk leaf and polyphagous shoot-hole borer behavior will be driven by separate submodels. Dispersal will initially be estimated by a regression of spread and time. This will inform a negative exponential probability of dispersal from nearby patches. Probabilities of colonization will be weighted by relative density in the source patch. For polyphagous shoot-hole borer, the connectivity of woody vegetation around vegetative patches will also increase the probability of beetle colonization. Behavioral submodels for cowbird parasitism will be developed via the analysis of extensive data sets of temporal patterns in cowbird abundance and parasitism on many rivers in California, following the pattern-oriented theory and development process. Cowbird models will be developed in daily time increments to allow for realistic simulation of cowbird control alternatives where success and cost effectiveness is strongly influenced by decisions made within a single breeding season. Pattern-oriented modeling is a common approach to developing and evaluating agent-based models. How does this work? Patterns are clearly identifiable structures and data that have been collected about real systems. Here are a few examples using monthly climatic data for cities. In the top graph, the red line represents high temperatures. The blue lines represent low temperatures, and the blue bars represent indices of precipitation. The first discernible qualitative pattern in this graph is that Boise, Idaho has hotter summers than winters. Another pattern is that the difference between minimum and maximum temperature is higher in the summer than it is in the winter. A third pattern is that rainfall in Boise is highest from November through May and lowest from June through September. These are all easily recognizable patterns that could be described quantitatively if necessary to see if real-world patterns could be reproduced by a climate simulation model. Patterns like this can be described from data collected on any ecological system or to describe the response of any species to its environment. For reset, we will define multiple patterns of system behavior at different spatial and temporal scales and levels of organization. We will then run model simulations using different combinations of behavioral traits and parameter sets for Vireo agents to find the combinations that reproduce the most patterns. This increases confidence that the behavioral rules we have given the Vireos result in the emergence of real-world patterns in the simulated model environment. We will follow best practices for sensitivity analysis of agent-based models. Once sensitivity analysis has identified which parameters have the strongest influence on outcomes, we will conduct uncertainty analysis to evaluate how potential bias in these influence parameters may affect all model outcomes and inferences. We will then use profilers, like the one shown here, to see if the influence of parameter values can be adjusted to do a better job of reproducing our preferred sets of patterns. In this way, patterns are a useful tool for calibrating models where biases associated with influential model inputs may overwhelmingly affect model outcomes. We will combine sensitivity analysis, uncertainty analysis, and calibration for each submodel independently, and then for the whole integrated model. Once we are confident that our calibrated model can reproduce the real-world patterns across space and time at different levels of organization, we will move on to applied model analysis. The primary method for applied analysis for agent-based models is the design and execution of simulation experiments. The graphics here show outputs for a single factor experiment where four different levels of the same factor have been used as inputs, resulting in different model outputs. For example, the graph on the left shows how 4 different climate models resulted in different predictions for sea surface temperature in 2100. The generic graph on the right shows how values of a response variable differ across 4 different management treatments. Many applied questions can be answered through well-designed simulation experiments of mechanistically rich agent-based models. Simulation experiments can be designed to test for main effects and interactions of multiple different stressors. In this case, the term factor would be synonymous with stressor in our ABM. The graph shows the amount of variation in 7 different response variables that were explained by the most important factor of a 5-factor experiment, pink bars. The combination of the remaining 4 factors, yellow bars, and the interaction between the main factors and less influential factors, 2 to 5, orange bars, results in summaries like this and plots that drill down on the interactions between different permutations of factors and are useful for finding main effects and interactions that are worth investigating in multi-stressor systems. Multi-stressor systems with interactions are difficult to study. For simulation models, the number of models run that are necessary to complete any given simulation experiment increases with the number of stressors addressed, the numbers of levels investigated per stressor, and the number of replicates that are necessary to draw inference given inherent system variability. Thankfully, best practices for analysis of simulation models have recently been developed, and there are a number of practical tools for robust and efficient design of complex multifactorial experiments. These and tools allow for examination of complex systems with a tractable number of model runs. We will use these types of experimental design tools to develop our simulation experiments. This slide provides a single practical example of the types of simulation experiments we may run with reset. The table shows factorial combinations of different amounts of cowbird control and vegetation removal that are within the pragmatic range of options available to management agencies. Since the cost of these management treatments is known on a per project basis, costs be estimated for different intensities of one management type or the other. By simulating factorial combinations of low to high intensities of cowbird control and vegetative control, we will be able to explore the potential cost effectiveness of different management approaches with a highly relevant evaluation metric for management agencies, that being Vireo population size divided by management cost. We will work with local and regional stakeholders to develop simulation experiments that explore management alternatives available to each of the major federal action agencies in Southern California. We'll also explore management strategies that involve cooperation among various combinations of federal, state, and local management authorities. These experiments will help to illustrate constraints associated with single agency management plans and how collaborative multi-partner management plans could be developed strategically to meet Vireo recovery targets in different recovery units where the mosaic of management authorities differ from one another, from one watershed to another. This calendar, the calendar for this project needs to be shifted forward a few months from displayed in this slide to align with the start for this project. However, this does display the planned activities that we will be undertaking in sequence and when they will each be completed. Ultimately, the deliverables for this work include new information and approaches for understanding and addressing multiple threats and stressors on a federally endangered species, the development of RESET, recovering endangered species with emerging threats, an innovative spatially explicit agent-based model for addressing threats and their interactions, a final technical report, Department of Defense specific management implementation strategy and user guide, peer-reviewed journal articles and conference presentations, multiple PhD students, postdocs, and undergraduate researchers. Thank you very much for your time and interest in this work.